I'm Giselle. Welcome to West B. Ready to take the next step? You're invited to join us for dinner on Sunday, September 22nd at 5 p.m. in the Fellowship Hall to learn about our vision, beliefs, expectations, and membership process. Additionally, we will explore ways that you can serve through our ministries at the church. Childcare will be provided. Reserve your spot at connect.westb.org. Men, join us on Wednesday, October 2nd at 6:15 p.m. in the East parking lot for pulled pork sandwiches, cornhole, and root beer pong. RSVP at men.westb.org. While the men are playing cornhole, ladies are invited to head to the chapel for bunco and food. Don't miss out on a great time. Kids and students will have regular programming. There will be no regular adult groups this evening. This week, we're continuing our Serve the Nations emphasis, and this week, we're focusing on our mission partner, Global Gates. Global Gates engages people from all over the world in gateway cities like Washington, D.C. and Houston. You can reach the world without leaving the U.S. If you'd like to find out more, go to missions.westb.org. Well, that's it for now. Let's worship together.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Yes, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and
For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again and saw some more people standing around. He asked them, "Why haven't you been working today?" They replied, "Because no one hired us." The landowner told them, "Then go out and join the others in my vineyard." That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. When those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more. But they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner. "Those people worked only 1 hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you paid us, who worked all day in the scorching heat." He answered one of them, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? So those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last." As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside privately and told them what was going to happen to him. "Listen," he said, "we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die. Then they will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, flogged with a whip, and crucified. But on the third day, he will be raised from the dead." Then the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons. She knelt respectfully to ask a favor. "What is your request?" he asked. She replied, "In your kingdom, please let my 2 sons sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus answered by saying to them, "You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink?" "Oh, yes," they replied, "we are able." Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. My Father has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. But Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many." As Jesus and the disciples left the town of Jericho, a large crowd followed behind. 2 blind men were sitting beside the road. When they heard that Jesus was coming that way, they began shouting, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." "Be quiet," the crowd yelled at them. But they only shouted louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." When Jesus heard them, he stopped and called, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord," they said, "we want to see." Jesus felt sorry for them and touched their eyes. Instantly, they could see. Then they followed him.
Is God unfair to people? Let's just start with a big question. There are two major ways we complain about God being unfair. One is this: good things happen to undeserving people. That's a bad person. Why does a good thing happen to them? Or secondly, bad things happen to deserving people. Hey, that's a good person. Why did a bad thing happen to them? Is life unfair? Is God unfair? Now, the problem with these perspectives is we become the judge. We make ourselves the judge as to who is deserving or undeserving. And we will often read the Bible with these perspectives in mind. And it's a wrong perspective, but let me walk through why. Consider the story of Job. I know we're in Matthew's gospel, but let's just go back to the story of Job. And you could describe the story of Job as a good man who deserved better, at least according to our own standards. I mean, horrible things happen to Job. Let's think about it. I mean, Satan oppresses him. He loses family. He goes through some horrible illnesses. And, Job's wife even comes out and just says, hey, just hate God and end it all. What an awful thing to say. His friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, they don't tell him to hate God. They just say, well, you should hate yourself. What did you do? And I mean, there's chapter after chapter after chapter of this. I mean, from chapter 3 to 32. It's this back and forth between Job and his friends. And Job just keeps claiming his innocence while these three friends try to assign blame to him. It's a tough book to read. What does Job do? He cries. He screams. He curses. I mean, in chapter 3, he says, I curse the day I was born and when they said it's a boy. I mean, paraphrasing there. Like, when I was born, it's a boy. I cursed that day. I cursed the day I was born. And you just see this over and over of him saying, I'm innocent. I'm cut off from God. Back to chapter 23, he says, if only I knew where to find God. But finally, in chapter 38, God speaks, and he speaks from a whirlwind. Job 38:2 says this, God speaks, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Can you imagine if God said that to you? Who are you to question my wisdom with such ignorance? And here's the hard part of this part of the book of Job. God doesn't offer an explanation. He doesn't offer comfort. He just presses into Job over and over again. Who are you? And who am I? And this goes on for 3 more chapters. Job tries to give an answer at the beginning of chapter 40, but God then interrupts him and says, well, I'm not finished yet. Listen some more. And then in Job, God says further at the second part of Job 40, only I determine justice. Are you more reasonable than me? Only God determines justice. Job doesn't get to determine that. So what is the lesson here? Hard book, certainly. The lesson is very simple. We are not consistent. We're not. God is always consistent. Okay, with that backdrop, the book of Job, let's talk about the parable of the vineyard workers. And in this parable, we're going to learn how God gives all of his grace to everyone. So we begin with a powerful punch and the book of Job and the challenges of what is fair or not fair. But we're going to end up in a good place. So back to the parable, Matthew's gospel, is the landowner, this is God, God's the landowner, that's kind of, the intended meaning here. Is the landowner being unfair by paying everyone the same amount? And are good things happening to undeserving people? In the book of Job, the question is, why do bad things happen to somebody who I think doesn't deserve it? But in this case, it's kind of the opposite. Are good things happening to undeserving people? Now, there has been some talk about this parable through more modern lenses, and Some people, it's not many, but some people have kind of shown this particular parable to be in some sort of support of Marxism or a socialistic agenda. And because it's out there, I just want to deal with it. It's not a mainstream thought, of course, but is this particular parable, is Jesus supporting a more socialistic perspective? The answer is strongly no. Let's just think about this parable from a very factual standpoint. The story involves a private landowner. So it's owning land. Communism outlaws private ownership. So story involves a private landowner who makes voluntary contracts with workers. These are not compulsory. And he makes these contracts according to the laws of supply and demand. And in doing so, no government power is telling the landowner what he can or can't do. This is something he has decided to do. So this is clearly not socialism. Some might try to make an argument that it's for capitalism. Capitalism wasn't quite invented yet, but if you have to pick one of the two, it's definitely more capitalistic than it is socialistic. So here's the question, and this is the question that arises. Is it against the law? This is what the landowner asks. Is it against the law for me to do what I want to with my money? Should you be jealous because I'm kind to others? A little bit more of a backdrop here. Generosity, this landowner is generous. Generosity will never work if the government imposes it on us. Now, if God tells us to do it, and if we are convicted by the Holy Spirit, that's when it works best. So, little historical context. I know I kind of stepped into it, a little bit there, but people talk about it, so I feel like we should at least go there too. But back to the text, back to the historical context of the text. Working vineyards in the first century was strenuous work, and it often required additional laborers to get the job finished in time. So this is not uncommon that you would start a job and you'd hire people throughout the day. And this landowner, again, he's a generous, kind landowner, respected in the community. He hires people who were just standing around at different points in the day. So he moves them from a place of unproductivity to productivity. And they were unproductive and given the opportunity to be productive. And so he hires them at 9 o'clock in the morning, noon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And he hires these different groups from town just to get the job done. So it's his right to do this. And he's really helping people out by doing this. And I love this. He offers to pay them. And it says there in the text, hey, what are you going to pay? Well, whatever was right. He says, I'll pay you whatever is right. So he must have had a good reputation for being a fair landowner because they agree to go work for him. And at the end of the day, now this is the fascinating part of the story. The fact that a landowner would be hiring people throughout the day to get the job done, that's not strange. But at the end of the day, he starts paying people and he pays them all the same. He pays them a fair wage, a standard day's wage, but he pays them regardless of how long they worked. Whether he hired them at 9 a.m. or 5 p.m., they all get the same thing. And those who had worked since the morning protested in verse 12. And it says, they're like, hey, those guys over there only worked an hour. Why are they getting the same as me? Now, was the landowner unfair? Back to this, the landowner is God, remember that. So this parable is about God. Was God unfair? Is the landowner unfair? No. He simply desired to be generous with those who worked less than a day. No one got less than what they deserved. Some people did get more than what they deserved. How does this tie into God's grace? God's grace to save every kind of sinner is an act of mercy, not injustice. Here's the deal. All sins keep you from God. All of them. And you may say, well, some people sin more. They do. Some people commit sins that have more severe consequences. They do. Is it unfair that God would extend the same grace to everyone? Not at all. None of us deserve grace. I love this parable. It ties into Romans chapter 9, if you look specifically at verses 14 through 16. What are we saying? That God was unfair? Of course not. For God said to Moses, I will show mercy to anyone I choose, and I will show compassion to anyone I choose. So it is God who decides. It is God who decides who he will show mercy to. We can neither choose it nor work for it. So this is not something that we earn. It's something that God gives. And then we get this great verse that is a very familiar verse 16 there. The first will be last, and the last will be first. Now, I want to be very clear about this. The first will be last, the last will be first. This statement is not about a race to the bottom, to see who can serve more than the next person. It's a statement about the extent of God's grace. Whether you were first or last is not what matters. What matters is whether you have received God's grace or not. Now, back to this passage in Matthew. Consider the two men who were healed. They were healed, verses 29 through 34. Were they deserving? But that's not the point. It's not the right question. What's important is that they followed Jesus. It says there in verse 34. That's the point. Jesus healed them, and then they followed Christ. Now, as this chapter progresses in Matthew, Jesus predicts his death in verses 17 through 19. It is Jesus who was last, so we can enter God's kingdom, so we can be first. He died so we can live. I mean, that's the principle here, that Christ gave himself for us. And then you get James and John. So, it's a great chapter here. James and John and their mother kind of get into the middle of this argument among the disciples about who's going to be the greatest, who will be the first in God's kingdom. And we see this passage actually in several different places. It's got several different perspectives on it. Matthew 20, Mark 9, Mark 10, I think Luke 9, Luke 22. You get this theme here. And hear me out. James and John would do many great things for Christ. John would be called the beloved disciple. He would become the pastor of the church at Ephesus. James was the first disciple of the 12 to suffer martyrdom. So they would do great things for Jesus. But Jesus first had to root out this combination of insensitivity, ambition, and arrogance. Because greatness ultimately is determined by God's standards, not our own standards. We talked a lot about this last week. If you haven't had a chance to go listen to last week's sermon, I would encourage you to do that. So James and John want a prominent place in God's kingdom, and they show an incredible sense of entitlement, insensitivity, and arrogance here. And Jesus had just finished telling them about his standard, which was sacrifice. But James and John wanted victory without sacrifice. And if Jesus had granted their request right there and then, where would they be? They want to be at the right and the left. Well, where did Jesus end up? He ended up on the cross. They would have ended up to his right and his left. They would have ended up on the cross. So Jesus doesn't rebuke them, but he does explain what greatness in God's kingdom really looks like. And that greatness has to go through the cross. In verse 25, Jesus explains how at the time the Gentile lords would equate themselves to gods, kind of like the Caesars. And these are powerful people in the community at the time. And their likeness would be everywhere. And people were required to bow to them. And Jesus is basically saying here, you're James and John, you're kind of asking the same thing. Do you really know what you're asking? You think you're really able to do this? In verse 22, they're like, yeah, we're able. We're eager for the honor. We're eager for the honor, but not eager for the sacrifice. And that's why Jesus says, you don't know what you are asking. You want a crown of glory? Okay, well, it comes through a cup of suffering. We want to come to God on our own terms and with our own conditions, but the only way to have a true and real relationship with God is on his terms and his conditions. Now, James and John, they would eventually be immersed in the same suffering as Jesus. They would suffer. And the reason that Jesus does not rebuke them harshly here is because James would be martyred. John would be exiled to Patmos. After being boiled alive, he somehow survived it and then was exiled to Patmos. They would eventually drink the same cup. Now, the other 10 aren't any better. In verse 24, we learn they're right in the mix of all this argument. They're angry too. They're kind of jealous that James and John are getting in front of them. And then we get verse 28, which is just this spiritual 2x4 to the face every time that you read it. And, it's for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Back to the story of Job. How did Job's story begin? I mean, if you look at chapter 1, Satan tells God, well, Job, the only reason he does all this for you is because he only wants your blessing. You've blessed him, so of course he's going to be good to you, God. Now, how does the book end? After all of that turmoil in the book of Job, you get all the way to chapter 42. And God says 4 times, my servant Job, my servant Job, my servant Job, my servant Job. You see it in that text. Why all this suffering? Job was God's servant through whom evil is defeated. God used Job to defeat evil. Now, if you knew evil could be defeated, but that you would have to suffer first, would you still do it? And for many of you, you would, because you would say, that is my calling. Yes, of course, I will do that, if you knew that it would happen. Now, in Job 42:10, we learn that, God gave it all back to Job, at least, part of it. But so he ultimately experienced victory, but even if his story didn't end that way, it would still be worth it. Job's issue was the same as James and John. James and John, they're like the vineyard workers. They wanted a good thing that they didn't deserve or earn. Job experienced bad things he thought he didn't deserve. But there's something even deeper here, and it's Job's real problem. Why did God press into Job? Why did God not offer comfort and an explanation? I mean, Job says here, I'm the innocent sufferer. I'm cut off. God says, no. There's only one sufferer who is completely innocent. There's only one sufferer that was completely cut off, and it's the man on the cross. And it's the cross. The cross demonstrates how the greatest evil can be used for the greatest good. Is God unfair to people? Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? I love R.C. Sproul's answer. Why do bad things happen to good people? That only happened once, and he volunteered. Here's one thing the cross shows us. God is not indifferent. God is not detached. God loves us. He loves you. God brings salvation through the suffering of the cross of Jesus. And Jesus' love is so perfect that he willingly took on the greatest evil for our greatest good. Do we deserve things? No. Do we deserve grace? No. Is God unfair? No. God is offering you the greatest gift of all, the gift of salvation. Might you suffer? Sure. Some people do. But through suffering, we see ultimately how God conquers evil. This text, it's all about the grace of God. I pray you will receive his grace.